It was a rather eerie garage. The Barrack apartments were the first in the city to have their own parking lot on the lower level, but it wasn't nearly as well lit or maintained as the newer ones. There was no security, and I couldn't spot any cameras. It felt strange since there were no restrictions on access either. All the parking spaces were assigned, and there were plenty of signs threatening violators with towing and associated fees. The location was in a low-traffic, non-commercial area, so I assumed they didn't have many problems. My mind started to wander. It was Friday evening, and I'd already been sitting there for 3 hours. My patience was wearing thin. My wife, Carlotta, was upstairs visiting Charles Henry Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, or C, as many called him, is the vice president of Gilbert Mechanicals, one of the largest companies in town. I wouldn't call him rich, but he's certainly well off. In fact, compared to me, he's wealthy. He's also charming, good-looking, and, I suspect, rather impressive in certain intimate aspects. So, it's probably easy for you to understand why I was here tonight. Carlotta and I had been married for 27 years. Back in high school, I was an average student, and she was just another girl. I guess you could say we were a pair of unnoticed kids who slipped through the system. We started dating and got married the year after graduation. She wanted to move out of her parents' house, and I wanted a regular romantic relationship. At the time, it seemed like a fair deal. I got a job as a painter, and within a few years, I had my own business. We had 2 sons, Tony and Greg, and a daughter, Sharon. We never lacked anything, but raising 3 kids meant we never had extra money to spend on the nicer things in life. My kids were the only ones in the neighborhood who never made it to Disneyland. We spent a lot of time at Nobles Grove, but that didn't quite make up for it. Besides that, we could only afford family vacations at the bungalow on Little Lehigh. Carlotta and I always got along well. There was never that wild, passionate love like in the movies. We were comfortable together, but I can't say we were madly in love with each other. I thought that was just part of real life. After having the kids, Carlotta kept her figure almost entirely, though her hips became slightly wider. She had olive skin and thick dark hair. When she turned 40, a streak of gray appeared on the left side of her hair. It was strange, but a bit stylish. She usually styled her hair to frame her face. I had to admit, she was still a beautiful woman. However, her beauty was balanced by her sharp temper. She could never be described as a warm person, and even the kids noticed this. As she got older, Carlotta became increasingly bitter. It was never directed at anyone in particular, just at everything and everyone in general. I had no idea what caused it. Tony and Greg graduated from school with achievements just as remarkable as mine. Ha ha ha. Well, not all of us can be geniuses. They both started working as apprentices for bricklayers, and within 2 years, they had their own small business. Not too shabby. Sharon got married and moved out as soon as she could. Once Carlotta and I were alone in the house, I became the target of her bitterness. I didn't eat well. I dressed like a slob. I wasn't in shape. I was stuck in a dead-end job and would never amount to anything. I made her drive a lousy car. We had no retirement plan. It was endless. I was sorry the kids had left because there was no one left to share Carlotta's anger with. Then, about a year later, it all stopped. My lovely wife, somehow, found a new interest that changed her attitude. Instead of constantly nagging me, she now simply ignored me. Oh, we still lived together as husband and wife, including maintaining physical intimacy, though it had become almost platonic. She continued cooking and keeping the house spotless, but the sarcasm disappeared. In bed, she acted the same as always, indifferent and unremarkable. I can't say it was a bad change, but it made me a little uneasy. I guess I should have been happy, but I wasn't. Of course, Carlotta's new interest was C. Jenkins. I had no idea where she met him or under what circumstances. All I knew was that they had a steady and serious relationship. All she had to do was ask, and I would have given her a divorce in an instant. She would have gotten half of everything, which wasn't that much. I patiently waited for her to bring it up or surprise me with the papers, but nothing ever happened. I assumed she was content with the way things were. I had no intention of bringing up the topic or arguing with her about it. Everything was going smoothly as long as she felt guilty about the affair. If I revealed that I knew what was happening, she would probably continue seeing him and start making my life miserable again. I couldn't take that risk. If she found out that I knew about C and kept seeing him, the humiliation would be unbearable, and I might have ended up doing something drastic. Then my children would have hated me, and I didn't want that to happen. It was a hell of a dilemma. Carlotta came into the garage alone. She got into her precious Civic and drove off without noticing my pickup truck parked in the corner. She needed to go home to prepare dinner. C usually ate out. I moved my pickup closer to his Lexus and settled in as comfortably as I could. I knew very little about my wife's lover. He was around 40, and as I mentioned, he was quite handsome. His photo occasionally appeared in the papers when he attended public events. Of course, Carlotta was never with him. One of his distinguishing features was a large ring on the pinky of his right hand. A big diamond, about 3 carats. Rumor had it that he received a big bonus when he became vice president, and he spent it all on that ring. After about 5 years of marriage, I had overextended myself and bought Carlotta a ring that didn't even have half a carat. I was a fool, but I was proud of what I had done. I watched as he came out of the building and headed toward his Lexus. He even walked like he thought he was something special. I didn't know this guy, but I hated him. Just as he unlocked his car remotely, I got out of my truck. The stun gun hit him before he could reach the door. I wasn't particularly smooth or cold-blooded, but I handled the job well. I grabbed both of his legs and dragged him toward the back of my truck. At first, his head and shoulders lifted, and then I twisted his legs around. In movies, this always looks so easy, but getting over 100 kilos of limp body into the bed of a truck isn't that simple. First, I taped his legs and arms with duct tape. When I got to his mouth, I wrapped the tape around his head several times, making sure not to cover his nose. I didn't want the guy suffocating in the back of my truck. Then, I covered him with a tarp and secured the bed cover. Before leaving, I took his keys and locked the Lexus again. 20 minutes later, I called Carlotta and told her I was trying to finish some work in Trexlertown and would likely be home late. She sounded a bit disappointed but quickly moved on. It was already dusk when I arrived at the bungalow. I had already chosen and prepared a good spot on the south side. 2 apple trees grew there, and we always talked about planting another one. A container with the new golden delicious tree I bought yesterday was sitting next to a large hole. The hole was round. I wasn't about to dig one shaped like a grave. Occasionally, I could hear a car passing by, but the bungalow was hidden from view by the thick undergrowth. He woke up when I pulled the tarp off him. I couldn't tell if he was scared or angry. "Hi, do you know who I am?" His eyes were wide with fear as he nodded yes. "Do you know why you're here?" His eyes darted around frantically, and he shook his head. I smiled, grabbed him by the legs, and dragged him out of the vehicle. As I pulled him out, the back of his head hit the edge of the door. He thrashed around as if he knew what was coming, but all he was doing was tiring himself out. I took off his watch and the expensive ring from his pinky, then put them in my pocket. His wallet and cell phone were already on the front seat of the truck. By the time I started pushing him into the hole, I could tell he was terrified. He kept trying to stand up, even though his hands and feet were tied. Eventually, I had to hit him on the head with the shovel to get him to calm down. It didn't knock him out, but it made him easier to handle. I began filling in the hole after placing him in a fetal position. He was still alive, and before I finished burying him, he regained consciousness. By then, all he could do was make faint grunting sounds. With nearly a meter of dirt on top of him, there was no way to escape, and finally, everything went silent. I took the new apple tree out of its pot, carefully placed it in the center of the hole, and filled it with a couple of bags of good soil for seedlings. I used the remaining dirt from the hole to finish the job, then neatly spread 2 bags of mulch on top. It was time to head home. My dinner had just been taken out of the microwave. My wife hadn't moved from the TV. The evening was quiet. I carefully hid everything I had taken from C in the garage, planning to get rid of it later. Carlotta went to bed early, and I spent the night on the couch. The weekend was busy. I had to rake leaves and trim the bushes. At least I didn't have to mow the lawn anymore. There was a good chance that no one would visit the bungalow for the next few months. Carlotta hadn't been there in years. This would give the new tree time to take root and not look like it had just been planted. The weekend passed quietly and uneventfully. On Sunday evening, I drove to Reading and got rid of the watch, wallet, and cell phone I had taken from C. Monday morning arrived, and I was ready to start a new week. Carlotta seemed anxious. I noticed her trying to call a number on her cell phone several times, but without success. Everything was fine until Wednesday, when the police showed up at my workplace and took me to the station. "Mr. Saunders, do you have any idea why you're here?" The name tag on his chest read, Lieutenant Detective Williams. "The only thing I can think of is that someone didn't like how I painted their house," I said with a smirk of irritation. "Do you know Charles Henry Jenkins?" "I know who he is, but I've never met the man. Why are you asking?" "Mr. Jenkins is a close friend of your wife, Carlotta." "Then maybe you should talk to my wife? What does this have to do with me? Did he accuse me of something?" "Mr. Jenkins hasn't said anything." Detective Williams shuffled through some papers on the desk. "Mr. Jenkins didn't show up for work on Monday, and he was last seen on Friday." "I don't know what to tell you. Have you spoken to the last person who saw him?" "We've been in touch, Mr. Saunders. That person was your wife." "I'm just a little curious. What kind of relationship does my wife have with this guy, Jenkins? And since he's her friend, why am I the one sitting here?" Detective Williams stood up from his chair. "Excuse me for a moment." I watched as he left the room and turned toward the wall with a large one-way mirror. A minute later, he returned to his seat. "Mr. Saunders, your wife has been close to Mr. Jenkins for about 6 months. She was a regular visitor at his apartment and even kept clothes and personal items there. Are you saying my wife's having an affair with this guy, Jenkins? Would you like some coffee, Mr. Saunders? Or maybe a Coke?" "No, damn it, but I'd like to know where this guy, Jenkins, is so I can pay him a visit. At the very least, tell me where he lives." From that moment, the conversation started to go downhill. The house I had been painting in Trexlertown was empty. No one could confirm whether I had been there or not. In fact, I had painted it the day before. All they had was my phone call to Carlotta, which didn't prove anything. I spent the rest of the weekend keeping an eye on my wife. I even made sure I was with people on Monday and Tuesday, just in case. After 2 hours, Detective Williams and his colleagues seemed disappointed and told me I could go. I told them that under the circumstances, they should convince my wife to stay somewhere else until I had a chance to calm down. They left me sitting in the room for another hour, and eventually, a patrol officer came in to inform me that Carlotta would be staying with Sharon for a few days. I spent the evening sipping beer and smirking to myself. The next morning, I moved all my things into one of the spare bedrooms. I wasn't going to sleep with Carlotta anymore. The following evening, Tony, Greg, and Sharon came over to talk to me. Their mother had confessed to the affair and expressed deep regret. She said it was a mistake and that she never meant to hurt me. It would never happen again. I listened to that nonsense for 30 minutes, trying to be as polite as possible. Once I agreed to let her come back home, everyone was happy and smiling. After they left, I had a few more beers and started smiling again. Carlotta returned home the next morning, and my sense of euphoria didn't last long. We never spoke about her affair with C. In fact, we barely talked at all. Our conversations were limited to the bare minimum required to function. I never accused her of anything, and she never offered any explanations or apologies. The police never contacted me again. A few small articles appeared in the local newspapers, and then everything went quiet. However, things with Carlotta didn't turn out the way I had hoped. She didn't feel any remorse, and soon, her old anger and bitterness began to resurface. She had lost her lover and finally realized he wasn't coming back. I got up early in the mornings and usually had breakfast, lunch, and dinner at one of the local diners. By the time I returned home in the evenings, I was always ready to shower and go to bed. Carlotta took care of the house and did my laundry. I never asked for more. We still shared bank accounts and credit cards, but she never abused them. There was no intimacy between us. The few times we were in the same room were tense. All the old arguments, hints, and insults came back. I found myself hoping she would find a new lover and regretting the end of her first affair. Even though she wasn't cheating on me anymore, she treated me like a fool. She knew that I was aware of her affair and had done nothing about it. What kind of man finds out his wife is unfaithful and then just gives in and accepts it? A weak man. I could see the contempt in her eyes every time she looked at me. To her, I was nobody. Little did she know, I was the one pulling the strings. I was the one in control. It was time to throw her off balance. All the kids planned to celebrate Thanksgiving at our house. I thought it was a great idea. It would give me the chance to set things straight. The kids had noticed that Carlotta had gone back to her old, nasty ways, but they didn't know what to do about it. I think they assumed it was my fault. Tony and Greg's wives, Sharon and Carlotta, were busy in the kitchen while the men watched football. I never cared much for sports, but today was a special day. I was pleased when Sharon announced that dinner was ready. There were 8 of us at the table. Normally, someone would say a prayer before the meal. This time, we decided to go around the table, with each person saying what they were thankful for. It's a silly ritual that feels like something a family from a TV sitcom would do. I didn't mind, though, because it gave me the chance to unsettle my wife a little. Most of the speeches were pretty much what you'd expect. Sharon took the opportunity to announce that she was pregnant, something we all kind of knew already. When it was my turn, I smiled and raised my right hand. Everyone got a good look at the shiny diamond ring on my pinky. I'm thankful for this magical ring, given to me by my beloved wife. It gave me the strength to set things right. It replaced my sadness with happiness. It rid me of humiliation and gave me pride. It gave me the courage to correct a terrible mistake. I'm truly grateful for my wonderful, magical ring. The table fell silent. Carlotta sat frozen, her eyes and mouth wide open. The rest of the family didn't notice anything unusual because they were all staring at me and my ring, trying to figure out what in the world I was talking about. "It's a really nice ring, Dad, but what's up with that strange speech?" Tony asked, breaking the silence, and soon everyone joined in, asking for an explanation. I just smiled and lowered my hand back to my lap. I looked at Greg, sitting to my right, and said, "Your turn." No one noticed when Carlotta quietly stood up and left the room. Everyone else, except her, had finished their turn giving thanks. Someone briefly commented on her absence, but then everyone started serving themselves. When I got up to look for my wife, everyone was too busy to notice. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, quietly crying. She looked at me with an expression that seemed to be a mix of fear and anxiety. Her eyes were swollen, and her cheeks were red. She didn't say anything, just sat there, staring sadly. "Carlotta, your family is waiting for you to join them. Freshen up and come back to the table." That was it. I closed the bedroom door and returned to our guests. 5 minutes later, my wife rejoined us, and no one mentioned her brief absence. The rest of the evening went as expected. I insisted that the kids take all the leftover food home with them. The girls helped Carlotta clean up, and everything was tidied away. The only thing the guys did was down a few bottles of beer and belch. I waved goodbye to the last of them and noticed my wife heading to the bedroom. I watched her go, a slight smile on my face, which was really more of a smirk. I felt so wickedly satisfied and redeemed. I had another beer before heading to my room. The next morning, I was unexpectedly greeted by the smell of fresh coffee in the kitchen. Carlotta was fully dressed and ready for the day. She offered me a cup of freshly brewed coffee, which I accepted and politely drank before heading to work. It was a small gesture, but it was a start. The contempt in her eyes was gone, replaced by a look of cautious respect. It was more of a tolerating gaze, but it still made me feel a bit uneasy. Work was tough that day. I figured I had a day, maybe 2, before the police came for me. Now that Carlotta had some inkling that I was involved in her boyfriend's disappearance, she wouldn't give up. I didn't care. I wasn't going to put up with her antics anymore. I wouldn't be able to give the authorities a plausible explanation about the ring. The following morning, Carlotta made coffee again and asked if I wanted some eggs or anything else. I took an English muffin with a bit of honey. Was this my last meal? Were the cops going to show up today? We didn't talk, but there were no unpleasant remarks either. The next week began the same way. On Tuesday morning, I had French toast. On Wednesday morning, she asked if I could come home early because she was planning to make lasagna, my favorite dish. Now I was genuinely scared. There were 2 weeks left until Christmas. I felt increasingly uncomfortable. Carlotta was planning something, and I had no idea what it was, but I knew I wasn't going to like it. When I was a kid, I hated devil's food cake. Everyone else in the family loved it, so my mom made it often. My favorite cake frosting was lemon cream. In an attempt to appease me, my mom started putting lemon frosting on the devil's food cake. I remember happily eating the sweet treat, but I always knew that beneath its flavor was that darn devilish cake. Carlotta was the cake, and her behavior was the lemon frosting. Sooner or later, the frosting would run out, and I'd be left with the devil's food cake. By that point, I had decided she wasn't going to the police or telling them about the ring. She had other plans, which likely weren't legal. I couldn't wait any longer. 2 days before Christmas, I closed the bank accounts and canceled the credit cards. There wasn't much money, but I decided I'd take it all. That's right, I was leaving. No divorce, no legal nonsense. I was just going to walk away. The house was a rental. We had never really been interested in buying our own place. We set up a small tree with gifts for each of the kids and their spouses. They were supposed to come over later in the afternoon. Unfortunately, I wouldn't be seeing them this year. Early Christmas morning, I placed a small jewelry box under the tree for Carlotta and quietly left the house for the last time. I drove west until I hit I-81, then headed south. I had a friend in Pensacola who was going to let me stay with him until I found my own place. I stopped for breakfast near Hagerstown. By now, Carlotta was probably opening her gift. Inside, she would find my wedding ring and the 3-carat diamond ring. It was too far to drive in one day, at least for me. Unfortunately, most motels were booked for the holidays. I finally found one near Chattanooga. The next day, I settled in comfortably with my old friend Tom and his wife. In the area, there were plenty of furnished mobile homes available for rent. Once I got settled, I found work at a company that specialized in flood and water damage restoration. They agreed to pay me under the table as long as I didn't give them my social security number. It was an interesting arrangement, and everyone was happy. I decided it was time to reach out to my kids. I didn't care about Carlotta, but the kids needed some peace of mind. One of my coworkers was happy to let me use his cell phone in exchange for buying him lunch. "Tony, it's Dad. What's going on? Where the hell have you been? It's a mess over here. Mom's losing it." "Losing it how? Is she crazy angry or crazy sad?" "Crazy angry. Christmas was a total disaster, but it got even worse afterward. When she found out you took all the money and canceled the credit cards, she went ballistic. Well, at least something good came out of it." "What happened?" "Before Christmas, everything seemed fine with you too. We all thought you'd figure it out." "Tony, it might have looked that way, but trust me, it was never going to happen. I decided it was better to leave before everything fell apart. We're not sure how long she'll manage with the money. None of us are in a position to help. Sharon suggested she get a job, and Mom exploded. I don't think she has enough to cover rent and utilities by the end of the month. Are you guys doing anything for her at all?" "We're doing our best to stay away from her. Since she doesn't have you to blame, she's taking it out on us. Sharon doesn't even answer her calls anymore. Even if we could help, it's reached the point where none of us want to." "Well, I'm sorry to leave you guys to deal with this mess, but you all insisted I take her back after she cheated on me, so now you'll have to live with it. Are you sure you don't want to come home?" "Not a chance. I've got a job in a good place. Next week, I'm buying a high-definition TV and a couple of packs of beer. I'm doing just fine." "Where the hell are you? The phone says you're in El Paso." "That's not my phone. Don't try calling me back on this number. It won't work. I'll give you a call again in a couple of weeks. Say hi to Greg and Sharon for me." I was glad things were going okay at home. The kids were having a rough time, but they were managing. My only problem now was deciding which TV to buy, a 32-inch or a 37-inch. Decisions. There was plenty of work for painters in the area. All the contractors had licenses, but it seemed like no one really cared about the workers. It was easier to look the other way. As long as the job got done and there were no complaints, everything was fine. I bought a TV and a small microwave. I was over the moon. I was making enough money to live on, so I didn't need to touch the cash I'd brought with me. I bought a disposable cell phone and called Tony 3 weeks later. Dad, I'm glad you called. Mom's in jail. What the hell is your mother in jail for? Remember that ring you were showing off at Thanksgiving? Yeah, what about it? You said you got it from Mom, right? That's true. Why are you asking? Well, Mom needed some cash and tried to pawn it. She got arrested at the pawn shop within 10 minutes. Damn, that's harsh. Why did they arrest her? You know why, don't you? I didn't answer, but I think he heard me chuckle. Mom told the police that you gave her the ring, but they didn't believe her. It would have been tough for the police to pin anything on Carlotta just because of the ring. They didn't have a body, a murder weapon, a motive, or any witnesses. What could they possibly charge her with? Making phone calls to her boyfriend? Tony, I'll call you back in a week. I don't know what to do right now. Let me think about it. I spent a few hours on the computers at the public library. The Reading Eagle had a few articles covering the investigation into Charles Henry Jenkins' disappearance. The biggest break they got was when Carlotta tried to pawn his ring. She claimed I had given it to her, and then I disappeared. When I called Tony next, he told me that he had reassured the authorities I was fine, just trying to get away from Carlotta. They spent a few days with my wife and said they understood why I left, but they still wanted to talk to me. Tony gave me a number I could call. Later that same week, I went to Biloxi and called the Reading Police Department. It wasn't the conversation they were hoping for, but they seemed satisfied with my answers. I simply told them that after finding out my wife had cheated on me, I felt I couldn't live with her anymore. Leaving was the only way I could maintain any sense of self-respect. I think they just needed to fill in a few gaps in their investigation report. Before heading home, I called Sharon. Most of my calls had been to Tony, since he was the oldest and, in my opinion, the most level-headed. She was happy to hear from me and immediately asked me to call Greg later that evening. The police didn't have enough evidence to charge Carlotta, so they let her go. Sharon said Carlotta packed her things into her car and went to stay with her sister in Frackville. Carlotta refused to speak to the kids anymore and told them to go to hell. We spent Easter break together at Disneyland. Everyone except Carlotta. Sharon was 5 months pregnant, but she still had a great time. I had denied my kids the chance to go when they were younger, but now it seemed like they were all enjoying it. The money I had earned was spent on plane tickets and admission, but it was worth it. I had lost my wife, but I still had my family. Someday, I'll have to go back to the family bungalow and check on the golden delicious apple tree. Someday. Thank you for listening until the end.